This happened to me a few years back. I live in a suburban neighborhood that borders a large park, which part of is public and the rest of is closed off reservoir. The public section of the park is sprawling over several acres. There are hiking trails in the woods, a baseball field, basketball and tennis courts, and a playground area. The park is accessible by car via a winding one-lane road that goes through the playground area and around to more remote sections in the woods. Eventually, this road leads out to a major, busy highway. At one point, it was used as a cut-through to get from the highway to my neighborhood and beyond. Nowadays, there are several much larger access points to the neighborhood, and the cut-through is seldom used. My story begins on a late winter afternoon. I was spending the day home with my now ex-husband, who was an avid runner. He decided to go out into the foot trail and take a run down the one-lane road. He did this often, and the crime rate in this area is extremely low, so I thought nothing of it. After about an hour or so, he comes back all sweaty. I asked him how the run went and his time per mile, etc. He tells me he was slower than usual that day and just wasn't feeling very well during the run. As he's heading to the shower to rinse off, he casually says, "Oh, I heard this dog whimpering in the woods when I was running." I'm a bleeding heart for the wounded animals and asked him for more specifics. He said that he had not gone looking for the whimpering dog because the noise had stopped shortly after it started. He then said the last thing we need is another pet and went off to shower. I sat there for a bit, looking at my 3 dogs laying on the floor and lazily pawing at each other. After a few moments, I couldn't stand it anymore, so I laced up my tennis shoes, grabbed my treats, and headed to my car. My husband was just getting out of the shower by the time I told him I was going to look for the dog. He said that I was crazy but didn't try to stop me, nor did he want to go out with me. By now, daylight was fast fading and it was close to 5:30 p.m. The spot he'd heard the whimpering was about 2 minutes from our house. I drove over and pulled my car to the shoulder, so as not to block the lane. I got out and started calling for the dog, "Here, doggy," and other similar phrases to see if it would start whimpering again and come out to greet me. I heard nothing, so after about a minute or so, I decided to venture out into the woods. The woods in this area of the park are not too dense, with trees that are spaced at least 8 to 10 feet apart, on average, and the forest floor was blanketed with fallen leaves. Every step I made was a loud crunch. I'd stop, call out for a little bit, be still, and then slowly move forward into the woods. I thought I could hear a dog whimper once or twice, but it was always happened when I was calling out, so I couldn't be sure. The less I walked, the less light there was, and the more dense the woods became. I had brought my cell phone, but this didn't have a flashlight up at the time. I've been out there walking, calling, and stopping for about 20 minutes, when I came upon a small clearing. I've always been fascinated by the occult, but all the stories I've read did not prepare me for what I saw in that clearing. The first thing that caught my eye was this formation of sticks, laid on the ground. The sticks were all the same size and formed a small circle. Inside the circle, there were 3 more sticks popped up on a tripod formation in the center. On the top of the tripod was a small doll's head, with the eyes missing from their sockets. I immediately had this "oh fuck" moment, where I realized that I was a woman alone in the woods at dusk, with no form of protection on me, and in a spot where I was clearly not meant to be. I froze in the place as I surveyed my surroundings. To make myself less scared, I called out again softly this time, "Come here, puppy." There were small bones in the pile at the far edge of the clearing, a bush to my left, and several more gouged eye dolls' heads hanging from the branches. It was not windy that day, but I swear I heard the rustling of leaves the last time I called for the dog. As I scanned the perimeter from left to right, my eyes suddenly fixed for a split second across the clearing on something in the trees. There, about 8 to 10 feet back in the bushes, was a man's face. I kept my eyes moving, because something told me not to let him know I'd seen him by staring or reacting in any way. The brief moment I glanced at him was enough to momentarily paralyze me. His hair was long and unkempt. His eyes were almost bulging as he stared at me. I couldn't see the rest of him because of the tree cover. At this point, my flight response finally kicked in and I was able to move again. I remember saying something to the effect of, "Silly dog must have found his way home," as I started to back out of the clearing, still scanning. He didn't appear to be pursuing me, so as soon as I was half hidden by the trees to my side, I took off running at full speed to my car. I couldn't tell how long it was or how far it was, but daylight was all gone now. I somehow made it back to the road, a few yards behind where my car was parked. I sprinted to it and locked myself inside. It took me 4 attempts to get my key in the ignition with how badly my hands were trembling. I finally got the car started and beat the hell out of there. I took the long way home to my house by going onto the main highway and entering my neighborhood through another well-traveled intersection. As soon as I was home, I called the police and reported what I had seen. They never followed up with me. The more I thought about it over the years, I'm convinced that this man in the woods was the one whimpering, to lure a gullible victim like me off the little road into the woods.
When I just turned 18, I figured it'd be best to move out on my own. It isn't like I had family problems or anything like that, I just really wanted to start my life as an adult. I'd often daydream about throwing crazy parties, being able to hook up without having to find a spot, and always having beer in the fridge, and basically just have a ridiculous amount of freedom. So, the summer after high school, I found this small apartment complex on the south side of town. It wasn't anything fancy. 5 apartments to a floor, 3 floors per building, and 7 buildings spaced out along a horseshoe-spaced road, with some woodland surrounding it. My apartment wasn't very big. Now, being fresh out of high school and working a super low-end job as a waiter, I could only afford a small studio apartment. I was fortunate enough to snag one on the 3rd floor so I didn't have to go up any stairs. I planned on going to college, but as some people know, it doesn't always work out that way. After fall and semester started, I still hadn't enrolled. I started doing double shifts at my work to keep myself busy. Living alone in a studio apartment can really take a mental toll on somebody. Seriously, it can. Sitting around all day doing absolutely nothing, waiting to go to work and only really growing older. Not to mention, most of my friends ran off to schools out of state and I was the only one left behind. I'm not throwing any parties by myself or for myself. I'm just saying. Anyway, I'd work these doubles all day. They were roughly 10-hour shifts depending on how busy the restaurant was. I'd come back super late at night, way past when the sun went down, walk through the giant horseshoe back to my apartment that sat all the way on the other end. Now, at some point in all of this, I realised that college was out of the question for me, so I started saving money for a new car. I kept most of my tip money in a large box under my bed, and when I'd come home, I'd pull it out, throw the money in, and then go and sleep. Well, that was my intention. The problem is, since I'd be working so much and just being a kid, I always wanted to go and get in some personal time by watching television, playing video games, or throwing on one of my favourite movies. I'd usually be able to stay up all night by doing it. In fact, I'd crush about 4 hours of sleep, then wake up, rinse, repeat. After so long, I couldn't really do this anymore, mainly because I had to cancel my cable in order to pay rent, as well as pawn off some of my gaming systems and DVD players. It really sucked for me. Movies and television were my life. I wanted to go to school to study them, but being an adult, it always costs a lot. Still, even after I had nothing to do, I still couldn't sleep. Like some people. I'd stay up all night, smoke a ridiculous amount of cigarettes and just stare out of my window in the middle of the night. Also, where I'm from, we'd get these crazy electrical storms passing from time to time, especially in the late summer or early fall. I just watch those all the time, having nothing to do really, open my eyes to my surroundings. In the end, I actually got to know all the people who like to smoke late at night. I knew how many people like to drive over to Taco Bell past midnight in order to get a snack. I also knew that the entire apartment complex would become a ghost town at around 2 in the morning. There'd be absolutely nothing going on. It'd just be me, either staring out of my window or smoking on my balcony. So one night, I decided to take a walk. I did laps around the horseshoe and listened to an old iPod shuffle. It was also very cold that night, so I wore an old hoodie that I had with the hood up. To be honest, I probably looked extremely suspicious, but honestly, I was just out for a walk. I followed this massive iron fence that wrapped around the entire apartment complex. I was heading back home when I came across something really weird. There was a gate, but it led off into the woods that surrounded the apartment complex. I found it rather weird. I mean, the place was gated, but There was no other place that had a gate on this side of the complex, not to mention that it obviously led to absolutely nowhere. It gave me chills to see that it was open. I just stared off into the harrowing darkness of the surrounding woodland. I hoped to see if anybody was out there, or maybe find somebody to talk to, just so I could forget about it. I didn't know what to do. I just kept moving. Luckily, I could see the gate from my apartment and decided to play a new game. Who opened the gate? After coming home from work, I placed my tips in the box, went to my window and stared out and looked for the gate. I could see it from my apartment, luckily. It was just really hard to see. There wasn't any street lights around that damned thing, and honestly, it looked like there wasn't even anybody there. This time the gate was shut, and when it shut, it blended into the fence perfectly. Nobody could see it unless they were opening the thing, which I did. I didn't bother to tell anybody because I didn't think it was a big deal. To be honest, I thought somebody was going out there to smoke a bowl or do some weird stuff in the woods. Honestly, I didn't know. I didn't really care what was going on behind there, but I did need something to pass my hours. So I'm just sitting there on the balcony waiting for things to happen. It's now way past 2 AM. I'm the only thing awake in this complex as far as I'm concerned, and I'm just smoking away a pack on my times. I then start getting tired and figured out that I'd call it a night, when I suddenly heard a squeaking or creaking sound coming from the iron gate. The metal sounded really rusted. It was way louder from what I remembered a long time ago. I lowered myself down, trying to hide myself amongst the shadows of my balcony. I didn't want to spook whoever it was going into the trees. I squinted my eyes trying to get a good picture. I could then see a shadow moving among the darkness of the tree line, but I soon realised that whoever it was wasn't coming from the apartment complex. They were going in. My first thought was that maybe it was a person who worked on the other side of the forest and used that as a shortcut through. I never saw it happen before, but maybe they discovered a new route or something. Maybe it was one of my neighbours. I thought that until my eyes had adjusted properly to the darkness, however. Whoever came from those trees wasn't a person that lived in my complex. They were physically handicapped. I think they were hunched in their back a bit. Their arms swayed back and forth, almost like they were dragging them lifelessly. The knees of this person were also really close to the ground, more than I could possibly imagine somebody still being able to walk with. The movement of the body was just haunting. I guess that's the right word. The sight of it alone could stop my heart. I couldn't tell the gender of the person, but they did have medium hair that covered a proportion of their face. The person then moved away from the gate, falling around in a very disturbing manner. They mumbled something to themselves. It was still loud enough that I could hear it. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but to be honest, it sounded like gibberish. I figured out whoever this was extremely disturbed. I held my breath as I watched the person move from behind the building across from mine towards the one right next to it. They actually stayed away from the streetlights that lined the horseshoe-shaped drive. They were trying to move through the shadows, avoiding detection as much as possible. I didn't even move an inch. I just watched as they started to make their way to a building. As it made its way towards the front of the building, it quickly looked over its shoulder. In doing so, looking right at me. Now I don't know if they saw me. I don't know if they did, but they were pretty far away and it was dark, but I swear to God their eyes widened and they scurried off into the darkness. They didn't stand there. They didn't change anything about their posture. In that weird low walk they entered with and brushed off faster. It was faster than most people could run. I blinked a few times because I didn't believe it at first, but when I heard that gate slam shut, I knew it actually happened. I didn't sleep at all that night. It felt like it was a terrible thing that had happened to me. I had to call in for the morning part of my shift because I was unable to sleep and let them know that I wasn't going to be going in. After the sun came up, I finally went to work. I ended up having to stay late because one of my tables stuck around after we closed and just wanted a few more drinks with the manager. They were friends or something. I did get a $50 tip, so I really wasn't complaining. When I got home, I went to stash my money in my box. I opened it up and all of my cash remained, but a note read in some of the worst handwriting I've ever seen. "I saw you watching me." My heart stopped. How the hell did they know my room number? How did they get in? I started freaking out and wondered if they were still around. Being a studio apartment, they didn't have a lot of places to hide in, so I quickly checked in my bed, under my bed, in my closet, in my bathroom. They were long gone. I took a peek out my window and saw the gate closed. However, the damn brush of woodland swayed back and forth as if somebody was moving in it. I freaked out and called the police. It took them a bit to get there, and when they did, it seemed like the whole apartment came alive. All the lights came on and everybody's come out to see what the disturbance was. When I told the officers what was going on, they made me feel like I was an idiot. They didn't believe me one bit. I had to then tell them where the gate was, but I didn't go down there because I didn't want to show myself. When they went to look, sure enough, the gate was there. Two then went into the forest to look for this thing, and two of them stayed back with me and got my statements. Eventually, the two officers did come back. When they did, they were pale as ghosts. When one of the officers that stayed back with me to take my statement pressured them, they finally opened up. They said they didn't find anybody, but they did find a bunch of personal items hung up in various trees around the forest. They thought it was really weird and they began asking all my neighbours if they were missing anything. Then surely enough, people lined up to go and find that personal items of theirs were missing. Nothing of value. There were pictures inside frames, a hairbrush, books, things like that. Really odd things for somebody to steal. The people at the complex were creeped the hell out. I mean, I saw at least 5 moving trucks the next week. People just wanted to get out of there and I don't blame them. The owners of the complex came and sealed the gate using a blowtorch. Turns out, they had no idea that it was even there in the first place. They didn't put it in. I got out of Dodge when I had the chance. I didn't do my nightly routines anymore, but sure as hell I still couldn't sleep. I left all my lights on and paid my electricity bill and made sure of it. I still couldn't afford to live in that place for much longer anyway. I moved back to the north side of town in a smaller, cheaper apartment complex that wasn't surrounded by woodland. I still have nightmares about all of the things that happened to this day. I grew up in rural Michigan and rode the bus to school every morning. We lived in a house at the bottom of a hill on a country road. My bus stop, however, was at the top of the hill after you passed my house. The story I'm about to tell all happened to me when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I woke up one morning and got ready for school like I usually did. My bus picked me up at around 7 AM. This was right when the sun was starting to come up, but there were still spots of darkness in the deep wilderness. I was the only kid who was picked up at my bus stop, so I would stand at the edge of the woods and wait until the bus came. Now my mum or dad would have to drop me off about 5 minutes before the bus came and hightail it for work in order to make it there by 8. It's not that they completely felt comfortable by doing this, but they really didn't have many options. And we also lived in a safe area, or so we thought. And the bus arrived on time 99% of the time anyway, so they weren't too worried about anything that would happen to me in the 5 minutes I was left alone. So I'm standing there, cold as hell, waiting on the bus to come, watching the sunrise slowly going over the skies. It's still a little dark out, but yet bright enough to me to see what's going on around me. I saw the lights of the bus in the distance, on time as usual, and it came to a stop right in front of me. Now my bus driver, Miss Tricia, opened the door and said, "Good morning," and gestured for me to hop on. I walked to my seat and put my stuff down, but noticed that the bus wasn't moving yet. She had the door ajar, and she just sat there. leaning slightly out of her seat, staring into the woods. After a good minute or so of this, she finally closed the door and we were off. After arriving at school, she escorted us in, which is something that she never did, and I remember seeing her slip into the office and talking to one of the secretaries. I went through my regular school day and was picked up by my dad in the car. That was like normal, but as he picked me up though, he started asking me all kinds of questions. Bus pickup okay this morning? Any cars stop and blow the horn at you as you waited? Strange questions that he'd never asked me before. The next morning, my parents didn't take me to the bus stop. My mum dropped me off at school before going into work at a later time. This continued, alternating a drop off by my mum or dad, and that happened for the remainder of the school year. At the time, I noticed they also changed my bus stop. It was only years later that I found out what actually happened. As my teacher picked me up that morning, she saw a man standing in the woods behind where I was, just staring at me. She then told the school secretaries, who then told the transport ministers, who then told the police. The police investigated and found some items wrapped up in a t-shirt back in the woods. There was a hunting knife, a rope, a rag or washcloth, and some tape. The police never found out who that guy was or who them things belonged to, but my bus driver, my parents, and the police felt certain that whoever it was, they had the worst possible intentions for me. I think about this often and wonder what would have happened to me had my bus driver been a few minutes late, or had she not noticed that guy standing in the woods after the bus I was waiting for. Because of this incident, the school district changed my bus stop to be located right in front of my house. That way, I could stay in my house until the bus pulled up. No more standing by the woods for me. I resumed riding the bus next year. I just want to say a massive thank you to my bus driver for saving my life.
I don't really know how to start this, so I'll just jump straight into it. I will try to keep it as short as possible, but also want to make sure that I'm saying everything clear. I'll answer any questions in the comments if anything is left unclear. I'm a photographer, and there is a nature preserve maybe 2 or 3 miles from my house. I don't live in the best of areas, so it is one of the few places I could go within walking distance to get a decent shot when I need to post some for my social media BS. Being maybe 19 at the time, I was fortunate enough to have my mother drop me off on the occasion. The plan was for her to show up a little over an hour later to pick me up, to save me the multiple-mile trek back to our little home. Unfortunately, this isn't how things panned out. Just as we pulled up, another car did as well, and just a few seconds later, my mother was a little suspicious because it wasn't a very popular destination. But my mother always worries, so I assured her that I would be fine and allowed her to head back to do things she needed to do at home. There are 3 different ways you can go in initially. A path that leads left, a path that leads right, and one up and through the middle. They all kind of loop back around at the same spot, but is a solid mile before it does so. I opted to take the middle trail as it is the most scenic, but paused near the entrance as I was still adjusting my equipment and taking some test shots before moving deeper, where I might potentially see wildlife or something worthwhile. This is when the man who pulled up after I did came in and proceeded to walk up the center trail as well. I continued fidgeting with my equipment even after having it properly adjusted as I waited for him to pass me. And as he did, he attempted to talk to me. Something along the lines of getting good photos, which any photographer will get when they are out shooting. I responded with something simple and kind, but also in a dismissive tone because I had no interest in continuing to converse with him. Something about him made me incredibly uncomfortable. So uncomfortable, in fact, that I decided to stay in the initial entrance area to photograph some boring-ass plants, even after he disappeared around the bend, and out of my line of sight. I'm so thankful I did that, because within 5 minutes he somehow managed to complete the full loop and end up behind me. The loop makes at least a solid 15 minutes to get through, and I'm in a hurry. The loop takes me at least a solid 15 minutes to get through, even when I'm in a hurry. He either busted ass to circle back around me or took a shortcut to do so. Noticing I was still by the entrance, he passed me again, walking the exact same way he had just been. This is when I noticed there was absolutely something going on. I stood there and watched as he walked the same exact path, even down and around to the bend out of my sight. I continued watching in the distance at the bend where I lost sight of him for a few seconds, and what do I see? Him peeking around the corner to see me. Once he noticed I saw him, he disappeared again. This is when I simply said, "Fuck this shit," and left. As soon as I exited the preserve, I took off in a full sprint, hoping I would put some distance between the two of us. Just as I was about to turn down a side street, I turned back to see him exiting the preserve and entering his vehicle. My phone was dead. I never charged the damn thing, and I had absolutely no way to contact anyone. I was at the point to where I contemplated running up to someone's house and asking them for help or to call someone for me. But I was worried that I might seem like a crazy person. I turned the corner and once again, we no longer had sight of each other. I was out of breath and unable to keep running. I just began to pray that he was no longer going to follow me. Maybe this was all of it. Just some weird coincidence, right? Apparently, prayer doesn't work because within a few moments, he was back in sight, turning the corner and beginning to approach on the same street that I was now on. My mind was racing, with all of the possibilities of what he was going to do to me. But without much time, I decided that I wasn't going to give him the opportunity to do anything. I continued walking until he literally pulled up within feet of me, with his window down. I threw my bag down onto the ground next to me, turned in his direction and balled fist and shouted with the full power of my lungs, "I will kill you if you don't get the fuck away from me." The angry little scowl he had on his face the entire time faded and began to resemble more of a deer in the headlights. He didn't know what to do, and then he nervously uttered, "I have rights," before speeding off to never be seen again. I then had to complete the walk home, constantly looking over my shoulder and hoping that he didn't make another approach. I'm just glad to have made the decisions that I made that day, because I genuinely have no idea what would have happened that day if I didn't. I do not know if this story will come across as horrifying, as it was in person, but if it doesn't, it's simply a failure of my writing ability.
So here's a bit of background first. I live in a neighbourhood with lots of abandoned houses. There's about 12 houses in my neighbourhood and over 7 of them sit abandoned. In one of the abandoned houses there's a playground in the backyard that the old neighbours left behind. Now I was 12 at the time and I knew in my brain I was a little bit too old to be playing on the playground made for 6-year-olds, but I just can't resist a nice swing set. I would spend some extra time over there, as it was usually summer and I would usually play video games. The house is past some woods you have to walk through about a block away from my own. It was a normal day and my mother said I should go to get some fresh air outside and that she was tired of watching me play video games. I thought it was a perfect opportunity to go to the swing set. Now it was absolutely beautiful outside this day, not too hot but still warm with a slight wind. So I put my shoes on and began the trek towards the forest. As I was about maybe 5 steps in, I heard a branch snap. Now I hear these all the time from squirrels, so I really don't think anything of it. I finally finish walking through the forest and reach a house. I open the back fence, look in and start to swing. I swing for about maybe 2 minutes when I hear breathing. Now I stop for a moment, trying to think where the hell this is coming from. After about 30 seconds of stopping, I force myself to think it was just me. I then continue for another 5 minutes and decide that I was done for now. As soon as I sit up, I hear, "Hey." I look around for a moment and then notice that there's a man, about mid-30s or early 40s. He has dirty gross black hair that's all over the place, a stained up sweatshirt, underwear with the back cut out so you can see everything. This guy was obviously homeless, but he had this crazy look in his eyes. Here I am, 5'2", 95 pounds with no strength, staring at a 6'2", 170 pound man. I wasn't really sure what to do at this moment. I mustered up all of the courage I could and said, "Hey, what's up?" The guy then stared at me and a massive smile came across his face. After 15 seconds, which seemed more like 40 minutes, he said, "Have room for one more?" I quickly said, "I'm actually leaving, it's all yours." The man opened up the gate and walked past me and sat down. He then began to swing. I then speed walked towards that gate and shut it and started walking into the forest as quickly as I could. About 20 seconds later, I hear a loud, "Get back here now," and heard the gate spinning open and running not far behind me. I practically have a heart attack and start running as fast as I possibly can. I somehow made it back to my house and locked the door without the man noticing where I went. I told my mum, who practically in tears called the police. The police searched around and came back a couple of hours later with no one. Of course. How was that going to settle my mind? So that night, I was tossing and turning in my bed when I heard footsteps in the street. I look out my window to see a man looking through the windows of all the houses on my street. I start to shake as I grabbed the phone and called the police without even telling my parents. The cops showed up a few minutes later and caught the man. The cops couldn't give us a whole lot of information though, but a few days later, the cops called us and told us that this guy has a mental illness and he's been living in one of the abandoned houses for a couple of weeks now, and that he planned on kidnapping me and doing God knows what. A few years ago when I still lived in upstate New York, something really freaky happened to me. If you've ever been to upstate New York during the winters, you know that it can snow a lot. I usually just spent snowy nights watching TV. I lived about a mile or so from any other house and my roommate was out. Now, I'll be honest, being alone made me feel uncomfortable. I always had an overactive imagination, and any small sound that I heard would really freak me out. Like I was saying, my roommate was out and it was snowing heavily. It was probably like 9 or 10 at night and I was watching TV like normal. All of a sudden, I heard a crunching sound outside on the snowy ice that was next to the forest. It was like somebody was stepping on ice. I immediately tensed up and my mind began to race over every possibility. Now I knew for a fact that it wasn't my roommate. He didn't have a car. I listened in horror as I could hear the crunches getting louder. I then ran into my room and locked the door. I got out my shotgun and grabbed my cell phone ready to dial 911 just in case. I know it might seem like I was overreacting, but remember, this is night, in a heavy snowstorm, miles and miles away from any other houses. Who could possibly be outside? The footsteps just stopped at some point though. I eventually fell asleep. When I woke up, my roommate was back. I then went outside to see if I could find any evidence of who was outside, and what I found still haunts me. I saw footprints in the snow coming out of the woods and circling around my house. The footprints were filled in for the most part, so it was hard to figure out where they were going. But the scariest part in all of this is the following. The footprints stopped directly outside my bedroom window. All of the other footprints were filled in, but these were fresh. It was as if somebody had been standing there all night, since the snow had stopped early in the morning. To this day, it scares me most not knowing just who or what is out there in those woods. The fact that while I was in my room, they were literally standing straight outside my window and I was expecting them to come through the door. I moved out of that house a few months later. So my family owns a cabin on a lake up in New Hampshire. We go there every summer. It's basically our home away from home. There are other houses on the lake, quite a few near us, but beyond that, it's a pretty rural area. There's literally miles and miles of wooded area. There's really no reason to be in these areas unless you're hunting, own a lake house, or visiting the lake for whatever reason. So one night, maybe 6 years ago, it was late, probably around midnight. My ex and I were just laying in bed chatting about whatever. All of a sudden, we hear footsteps outside the open window. Now the window only lays about halfway up the wall on the side of the bed, and it's situated so that it opens right to the bottom of the bed where our feet are. The ground around my house is covered in a layer of pine needles that all drop from above. So to be honest, it'd be pretty hard for somebody to walk quietly. But the footsteps sounded like whatever it was making them were trying their absolute best not to be heard. They sounded relatively close, but we rationalised to ourselves that they were probably made by some kind of animal. All goes quiet for a short while now. We begin to think maybe it's over. But then, a few minutes later, we hear them, but this time they seem much closer. They seem to be right outside our window now, still trying to move quietly. At this point, the two of us are starting to get freaked out. To our own mutual horror, we look down and see a hand slowly coming through the window. We obviously scream and wake up the house. My parents come running out of their adjacent bedroom. The hand then quickly disappears, and I tell my dad exactly what has happened. He then rationalises that it was both of our imaginations playing tricks on us. To this day, I don't know if he's right. The weird thing is that both my ex and I saw the exact same thing. How could both our imaginations materialise this at the exact same time? To this day, I feel uneasy staying in that room, and I always make sure to shut the window before I go to bed.
I'm a 17-year-old male living in the Midwest. My sophomore year of high school, my friends peer pressured me into joining the track team. I thought that this was a good idea because I wanted to improve my stamina. So due to this fact, I was asked to join the long-distance track team. To practice, our small team would run in the woods, and then to a lake. These woods are mostly used for off-road biking, so we would run in the forest in the diet paths that the bikes would make. After school, we would run in these woods every day. Time to time, we saw a deer. These deer would get very close, so much though that one would only need to take 3 or 4 steps to pet one. These woods were fun to run in because they could become so secluded, and I could really enjoy the nature. The last day I ran in these woods, it was just another day. Due to my poor stamina, I was pretty far back in the rest of the group, and I had produced a fairly painful side cramp. In fact, I stopped to take a breather. Let me give you a layout of the path I was on. The bike path is cut into a slope, dividing it into 2 parts. The upper half is surrounded in trees, and above is just more woods. The other half is the slope that leads to ponds and more woods. As I was admiring nature, I heard a loud snap high up in the woods. In so many scary stories, people say they get that feeling where they feel dread or that the hair on the back of their neck stands up. This feeling is very real, as I too got this feeling. Turning around, I expected to see a deer, yet to my utter horror, I saw a man. He was pretty far away, but I saw his jeans and long-sleeve checkered shirt. A bit of background on myself. I am currently a 3rd-degree black belt in Taekwondo, going on 15 years of practicing martial arts. Still with my knowledge of self-defense, I was put off and began a light jog. To my utter horror, the man began to sprint down the slope at an angle. The creepiest part of this sudden sprint was how he used the trees to propel himself. I suddenly realized why he was running at an angle. He wanted to cut me off. Realizing I could not outrun him, I said a prayer and ripped off an old stick of a fallen tree. The man finally made it down the hill. I was faced with what I believe was a homeless man. The smell was very pungent. His eyes were bloodshot and he had an unkempt beard. I warned him to fuck off, and I raised the stick. The man smiled and said words I will never forget.
"All I want to do is play."
At this comment, I closed the distance, delivering a kick to his groin. He moaned and began to stumble. I brought down the stick as hard as I could, breaking it over his head. The man fell on the path. With an utter fear in my heart, I ran as fast as I could. My coach was waiting for me at the end of the forest path. She could see that I looked fearful and asked me what was wrong. I smiled and told her nothing. I decided not to tell my coach anything because I didn't think she'd believe me. After a few days, I decided to tell my parents, who told me to tell my coach immediately. I told her the next practice, and we did not run in those woods again. To this day, over a year later, I still have decided not to enter those woods. And to the man, for your sake, let's not meet ever again.
So I used to live in the craziest part of San Francisco, Baker Beach. Baker Beach is located in front of a formerly abandoned hospital turned condominium, and the only way back late night is walking over a mile through the woods in the northern part of the city. Pics will be included in the comments. In addition, this is where the Zodiac Killer killed people, and these are the ones that remained unsolved. To top it all, the part of the woods is used as a graveyard that was dug up years ago, so yeah, this all makes it creepy as hell. Needless to say, I always carry a large knife on me. So, I'm walking home from smoking at my friend's place from the bus stop to my house. I noticed that a guy in a black hoodie got off at the exact same stop as me. I started walking off and he notices me, and then he begins tailing me for a few hundred feet. It's almost a block length. I keep on walking regardless and he keeps on following me. Now I can't get a good look at this guy. His face is hidden under the black hoodie, so I can't make out even if it's male or female. But I can see he has something that he's holding in his waistband. I don't know if it was a knife, though it could have been. Due to the distance, I'm pretty sure it was. I finally hit the gate, and as I looked back, I see him turning into a house entrance. I breathed a sigh of relief and mocked myself for being so paranoid. I took one look back over my shoulder just to make sure he wasn't there. This time, he was just staring around the doorway at me. He then began following me again. He began to follow me as I reached the entrance of the woods and picked up his pace. After being in the woods by about a few hundred feet, I decided that I was going to confront him. Full of adrenaline, I turned under a street light and made a huge smile come across my face. It was the creepiest I could muster, and I lifted my big knife up and charged at him screaming. I was screaming incoherently, but by God was it loud. It was more than enough to get people to hear what was happening, but way more than enough to scare him. He started panicking and started to reach for his knife, so I screamed even louder and he then took off running. I was yelling about how I was about to eat him. So yeah, I out-crazed the crazy. I still don't walk in those woods alone at night. I'm just thankful that I never met him lurking deep in there, and I actually saw him.
This story takes place in August of 2013, in the mountains of South Oregon. I am a USAF Security Forces airman, in other words, a military policeman. My girlfriend was at work, and as a swelteringly hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick and I decided to go exploring some back roads and get out of the heat in town. South Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used and many totally forgotten and grown over. Nick and I spent many of our days searching on roads that we knew, finding roads that we did not, and driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building over the mountains, we set off on a road that we'd never been on before and began the drive into the mountains. After driving for about an hour, we hadn't seen nor heard any signs of any other people in the woods. We rounded a bend into the thick fir woods and emerged into a meadow that was totally surrounded by thick aspen groves. The meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, hardly any insect noises, no squirrels, and certainly no other people. On the far side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. The table was very odd, however. It was painted a bright orange, and was much larger than a typical picnic table in a park. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the aspen grove was unsettling. Also, it was nearly impossible to see far into the trees, as aspens grow extremely close together. When we parked by the table, I hopped out the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5'5", but regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning I would have to climb up to even sit on them. As I was looking at the table, Nick called me over to the truck, and I noticed that he was looking back into the aspens. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at, but then I noticed a splash of colour that was completely out of place in the thick trees. A small, one-man tent was set back in the trees, about 50 feet away from this strange table. I had an initial feeling of dread hit me, and felt certain that there was someone in that tent, and if we could see the tent, they could undoubtedly see us. There were no campgrounds in the area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely someone camping so remote would be, well, at the very least, a strange person. However, as we observed the tent, we didn't see any movement, nor hear any strange sounds coming from it. Nick suggested that I call out. I didn't want to, but I did. "Hey, anyone in there?" There was no reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about driving away and leaving this strange area. But we began to fear the worst. What if there was a body in that tent? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped? Foolish, I know, but we thought it just the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the campsite, should there be any need to leave in a hurry. He would be waiting at the wheel, my heart pounding. I started walking through the trees towards the tent. I was totally keyed up, with my senses on full alert. When I reached the campsite, several things struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered all over. No fire had been built, and no wood collected. The tent, oh the tent, it was literally full of backpacks and women's clothing. Full of dread, I turned to leave to tell Nick what I had seen. As soon as I left, I heard Nick begin to yell, "Let's go, let's get out of here!" Not knowing what he was yelling about, I ran back to the truck. When I broke out of the trees, I saw a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately leapt into the passenger seat, and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by 2 men, and the third person was laying against the window of the back seat. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us from the road, but Nick drove around them and accelerated the way that we'd come from. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road. Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified that they would catch up, we hit the highway without seeing the car again. I still don't know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police and they promised to send a trooper out to check the scene. I received a call the next day from the trooper, stating that the campsite and the backpacks and all the women's clothing was gone, though he could tell that people had been in the area. The strange table was still by the thick aspen grove, and I have not returned to the area, and do not have any intention of doing so again.
I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's really beautiful with hundreds of miles of national forests. There's some great state parks and a ton of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of people where I live are really poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer. I do most of my work online. If I didn't have that, I wouldn't have much going for me. If I didn't have this, I would literally have to move somewhere else. It's one of those small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there for too long. Excluding a handful of doctors and lawyers and Georgia Power Company employees. The only employment in the area is a Walmart, fast food joints and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town, there's the massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, though to be honest, it's pretty unnerving most of the time. There's no signal for literally miles and it's about 10 miles away from town. In the past there's been lots of vehicle break-ins in the trailheads. The gravel parking lots also are usually filled with litter and broken glass and whatnot, I'm guessing from car windows. There's usually really dodgy people hanging around these trailheads or just driving around on the Forest Service roads. There are really rough roads too, and you'll see these beat up $500 cars just barreling along the roads for maybe a moment of joy. All that being said, it's actually a great place to go camping, however, you have to be very careful. A few years ago, a couple of my friends and I decided to go playing paintball in the national forest. It probably wasn't legal, I know, but we decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip so that way we could play the next morning as well. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drive a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up all of the spots in the area. This was really the only camping spot that we were familiar with, and it was pretty great to get to. It was getting dark now, so we decided to keep on looking, so we decided for about an hour or so further into the woods. By this time, it's a bit dark and we're getting a bit worried about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had any signal. Wasn't really surprising, to be honest. We then turned onto a road that really wasn't in very good shape. It had a broken metal barrier laid in the woods nearby. That being said, it looked like 4x4 vehicles had been going over it continuously. Now our F-150 actually had a pretty high clearance, so we managed to get over all of the dirt mounds. There was an old gravel road on the other side, and the other road was pretty much clear of debris. We went onto this one. We drove down that road for a few miles, and we eventually come across a small creek. There were some blue traps hanging over plywood nailed to a tree. It kind of looked odd. That said, it was pretty much dark at this point, and we didn't want to keep on driving around all night looking for a good camping spot, so we left the truck light running and set up our tent. As we were about to set up the tent, we noticed that there was a lot of trash in the woods and surrounding area. I then noticed that there's some green bottle on the floor. After looking closer, I see that it's insecticide. I was really tired at the time, and I just thought somebody had been dumping their home garbage out here, but none of us were weirded out at the time. There was nothing too bad about it, or so we thought at the time. So we set up camp, had some beers, chilled for a bit. By this time, it was probably about 11 PM, and just as we were eating, we noticed that there's a weird faint glow from the other side of the hill. At first, we were convinced that it was the moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles didn't make sense. It seemed to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It was kinda like the glow you see over a bright city, and we couldn't find out what the light source was itself though. Since there was no other access to the area, we decided it was not campers. The hill was about a quarter of a mile from our campsite, so we decided to investigate. Under any normal circumstance we wouldn't have went, but we had some alcohol in us, and two of us, Jacob and I, decided to take a look. My other friend Isaac decides to stay put behind and just put some popcorn on. We started walking towards the light source and the situation gets even stranger. All of the trees in the area have their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could have been the work of a beaver that lived in the creek, but it seemed strange that a beaver would go around doing this in a circle. Jacob and I started talking about the ghost beaver in pretty loud voices, due to our fear and drunkenness. As we're almost at the top of the hill, Jacob trips up and lets out a yell. Only seconds after he does so, the light, whatever it was, went out. We then looked at each other and decided that maybe we don't need to see what the light was after all. We walked back in silence, looking back every so often. We decided to turn off our flashlights and just use the moonlight to navigate back to our campsite. When we're a couple of 100 feet away from the campsite, I can see my other friend Isaac walking around the campsite. He was wearing a hooded coat and I hadn't seen him wearing this before. For some reason he's carrying his paintball gun. This is a little odd. We said to each other. The fire had started to die down and we couldn't see our campsite very well. At this point, we've probably been gone for almost an hour. From the distance that we were, it looked like Isaac was looking at something further off. He kept walking around the site and peering in the tent. When we got back to the campsite, we saw Isaac walk up to the road that we came in on. We figured he was going to use a bathroom and didn't wander through the woods like we did. When we got back though, we sat next to the campfire and waited for him to come back. All of a sudden, he comes lurching out of the tent and he vomits. It's obvious that he's had more alcohol than the rest of us. We ask him why he's been wandering around with the paintball gun, acting all strange like that. Then he comes up with a strange look on his face. They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it? We go and check the truck, enter the door code and see our paintball equipment just as we had left it before. The keys to the truck were also still hidden in a magnetic fob underneath. I get a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Isaac, what were you doing after we left? I was watching a movie on my phone, then I fell asleep, I guess. But weren't you walking around with the paintball gun? Did you just change jackets? Isaac said that he'd been in the tent the whole time that we'd left, and he'd been wearing that same fleeced hoodie all night. Somebody had been walking around our campsite. It wasn't Isaac. At this point, all of us are way too drunk to drive, but we decide to go ahead and pack up and go back towards my house for the night. We didn't bother packing up the tents, we just fold it with the sleeping bags and everything in it. We jump in the F-150 and drive out. As we approach the hump in the road, we can see that there's something grey blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been lying in the woods earlier is now on its stand. By this point, all of us has sobered up to the situation. Nobody wants to get out of the car and move the barrier. Now I did have a metal guard on the F-150, so I slowly drive forward, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck, and it falls right off, and slowly we drive over it. We're terrified that it was going to pop one of the truck's tyres and that is it, we'd be done for, not able to drive anywhere, but luckily it didn't. As we drive down the road, we see that there's a vehicle following us with its lights off. It's probably about 1,000 feet behind us, but we keep catching glimpses of it in the moonlight as it's reflecting off the front mirror. I start to drive as fast as I can on the Forest Service road. The other vehicle keeps its pace. It doesn't get any closer though, it just stays 1 or 2 turns behind us. We only see it when the road then straightens out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we make it back to the main paved road. I start to drive everybody back home, but I decide that it's best to go a different way just to be safe. I still have no idea what to make of that night even to this day.
(2008), Northern Ohio. My cousin invites me to go camping on a trip to see some hidden state park or whatever, and I happily agree because hey, Ohio has to be better than Indiana, right? So I drive out to their house, and we pack up our tent and food and head out to his truck for a few hours into the boondocks. After miles of twists and turns, the road gets bumpy, and I wake up and we're off the grid, like dirt road and grass off the grid. We park the truck and head up into the hills for a couple of miles, and make base camp at the top of a hill, looking out onto a valley with thick trees on the edges across from us. Nightfall comes fast, and when we're around the fire, I ask them what the park is called. Upon hearing me, they break out into laughter and say that we're not in a park at all, but on native land, and that we were camping upon some sacred hill. I call bullshit, but they name a tribe which at the time sounded legit enough for me not to argue against it. It was 1 AM at this point, and we were just chatting around the fire and eating marshmallows, when out of nowhere, we hear a bone-chilling scream. We all grew up hunting and have heard our fair share of animal calls and howls, and yet none of us could agree upon what we heard. If anything, I would say a screaming fox, or maybe a wolf because of how the howl was carried. It goes on a few more times, and our laughter soon becomes uneasy, as it appears to be getting closer to us. The 5th time we hear the scream, it sounded as if it was just coming from down the valley. We all look down in that direction, and I kid you not, out of the tree line, we see what looks like a gangly, thin, naked man, who from this far away seems way too tall to be normal. This thing takes off in a sprint on 2 legs at us, and without any hesitation, the 3 of us run off the hill and back into the woods towards the car. Being night, it only made the escape more terrifying. As we reach the bottom of the hill, we hear the scream again, but this time it's from where the camp was. None of us turn back to check nor to see if the other 2 are near. After the fastest 2 miles in my life, we get to the truck and floor it off the land to the nearest McDonald's, where we sat until dawn with no words to each other. We agreed to go back in the morning to grab our things. We do, and to our surprise, nothing had been moved or taken, which seemed weird, because if someone was trying to mess with us, they would have trashed the place or at least taken something. We drove back to my uncle's where we tried to joke about it and just move on. This stuff never bothered me, until I saw my friend playing the game Until Dawn, and I became uneasy, and how it looked like what we saw. That stuff is real, and I know it's out there.
Hunting is a huge part of culture in Hawaii. Kids often learn from a very young age how to hunt. My cousin, who's in his late 20s, has now been hunting for a good 20 years of his life. He's had some strange experiences in the wilderness, but this one has always stuck with me as the weirdest one. Have you ever heard of a call-in spirit? Well, you get the gist of it, and I'm sure that they exist outside of Hawaii, but they're basically like if you're somewhere in the woods or alone somewhere, if you hear somebody calling your name, you do not answer. Bad things will happen when you answer. Now I'm gonna write the story like he told me. I was around 8 years old when this happened. We had just started hunting. Me, my cousin and my uncle were hunting one evening in Wola. By the time we were done, we were about a mile away from our truck. It was about 9 PM and it was very dark out. My uncle said, "I'm gonna get to the truck. You kids wait here." but my cousins wanted to go with my uncle. I said, "I'll wait here, you come get me, I'm not walking." I was over with walking and my cousin was like, "Are you sure?" Even my uncle said, "You sure you want to wait alone?" I said, "Hell no, but I'm not walking, I'm gonna wait." So he said that he would be back in half an hour with the truck. Not too long after they left, I heard something moving in the bushes. Then I heard my uncle's voice, "Hey Kai, come on, let's go." I said, "Hell no, I'm not walking back." Then my uncle whistled. You know when you're out playing with other kids in the neighbourhood and your dad whistles for you to come inside, and you know when you hear that whistle that you better go faster? That's the kind of whistle it was, so I jumped up and started walking. My uncle was walking ahead of me. I couldn't see him in the bushes, but I could hear him because he's saying things like, "You don't want to listen, you're going to get in trouble." Then he said, "Come on, let's go down here." He wanted to go into the bushes off the path. I knew something was wrong. I said, "But I thought you were going to get to the truck." Just then, I saw the headlights back in the direction we started. Then I heard my uncle's stereo blasting, the only song that he ever plays when we go hunting. I then start running like I've never run before. As I take off, it feels like there's something or some kind of weight on my backpack. I still don't know what it was to this day, but I threw my bag off. I then run up to my uncle's truck and he says, "Where's your stuff?" I point back to where I was and say, "It was following you." My uncle yells at me and we have to both get in the car and he immediately takes off. Now to this day, I don't know if it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I do know that there was something out there with me and I was not alone.
So, as a kid I lived about 100 miles away from the nearest town, at a house without electricity or running water, which is the works in the Colorado Rockies. This place was in the absolute middle of nowhere, and we frequently saw all kinds of wild animals, ranging from elk, deer, coyotes and cats. Our property and a bunch of other neighbors' properties bordered national forest roads, so to keep people off our road, we had to gate about 1.5 miles from our house that we drove through before we reached our house. This time of year, we are the only people up there, as all the other homes are hunting cabins, long empty by this time in late winter. Now, this was not the type of gate that you could drive around if you forgot your key. There were tons of trees all around it, with barbed wire, ditches and such, so anyone wanting for off-road around it would basically have to build a new road around this gate. Well, one night, my mother, brother and sister and I pull up to the gate, and we cannot find the key. It's gone. So one of us, i.e. me, has to walk all the way back up to the house in the pitch black to fetch the spare key and make their way back down. Now, it's recently snowed in January, and it is totally dark. You can't even see your hands in front of you dark, and with the new snow, you can't hear anything either. There are a few clouds in the sky, on and off to let some starlight through every once in a while, but it's dark, and of course there isn't a flashlight either. So off I go. First you walk through around 200 meters of trees, then it opens up to a huge meadow, which then narrows back down again to trees for another 200 meters, and then opens up again into another huge meadow, which on the other side of is our house. I set out and everything seems fine. I'm just irritated that I have to do this. I'm about 15 years old at the time and a little angsty teen that is peeved off at the slightest chore. I was not thinking about my surroundings in the slightest, but as I'm walking, I get that feeling that I'm being watched as I'm halfway through the first meadow. That deep, creepy dread that something is right behind you, and you can't see what it is, made it 1,000 times worse by the lack of light and lack of being able to hear. My first instinct was to run, but I knew that if there was something, I was just going to provoke it, so I kept going, and then stopped to try and listen, as I heard a crunch echoing my footsteps. Holy shit. This time I walked a little faster, and I knew there was something behind me. It was probably a cat as well, so I just kept walking right into the second bunch of trees before it opened up into a meadow. I could see our house. I could feel the pressure. At this point we were predator and prey, and I could feel the breath on my shoes. So second clearing comes up and I know what the plan is, and I am about to book it. Thankfully, I'm familiar with what to do, and I scream as loud as I can. As I do so, my dogs hear me and they run to chase whatever it is from behind me. They continue running past me and I book it into the house. When I get in, I grab the 12 gauge first and the keys second, then pick up the tractor keys and jump in. There was no way I was going to walk that again. As I'm driving back towards the gate, I see the dogs running back. At least they weren't hurt. That could have been extremely dangerous. I also see the tracks. I knew it was a cat. It actually started approaching me from the first meadow and was tailing me for a long time. I tell my family the whole story, and I know that I'm not going to get any sleep tonight. From that day, I refused to be out alone at night in the countryside without a weapon.
On a road trip with a friend, we hiked into the trail in Colorado one evening to camp so we wouldn't have to pay for a campsite. We found a little clearing by a stream. My friend set up the tent while I decided to sleep under the stars. Right as we were getting ready to sleep, another woman showed up and pitched her tent in the clearing as well. I hadn't been feeling well that day.
I'm not really into the paranormal, but I had an experience about 10 years ago that I've never been able to explain. It was fall of 2006 or 7, and I was making the 2-hour drive home from university along rural country roads in northern Minnesota. The roads along this route are paved, and ditches are well maintained. The land just off the right-of-way is forested. For anybody curious about which road I was on, it's Country Road 58, near Two Inlets, Minnesota. I was in a section of roadway with nice long winding turns, and it was very fun driving. It was just dark enough at the time to need headlights to see, and as I came around one of these winding turns, the beam of my headlights caught a humanoid figure standing in the long grass in the ditch, maybe 50 feet in front of my car. As my car turned and my light shone on it, the thing strode gracefully but quickly the 20 or 30 feet into the woods just off the right-of-way. This thing was at least 7 feet tall, taller than a normal man, but standing naturally erect. Definitely not an animal on its hind legs. It was grey with no hair and very thin enough to see its joints. Similar to that stereotypical grey alien type figure, it walked so quickly and gracefully, I'd never seen anything like it. Wildlife typical to that area include bear, deer, rabbits, and the occasional wolf, but I can't think of anything that explains what I saw. After I saw the thing, I contemplated turning the car around to have another look or maybe just find some tracks, but I was in full-on freak-out mode, so I just kept driving. I was pretty shaken up when I made it home. I'll state for the record that I am a Christian, and that I've tended to wonder if I saw some kind of demon or evil spirit. From the feeling it gave me, I certainly don't feel that I saw an angel.
A buddy and I were hiking at dawn during a camping trip. We're walking along a path and I hear a zing like a bird chirp by my ear. A second or so later, a tree kind of pops next to my buddy. It's at this point that there was an accompanying crack and we'd realised that we'd been shot at. We informed the park ranger around noon and he ended up finding an old guy hunting illegally. Not sure if he was charged with anything, but I have no idea why he was shooting that close to us. There were no animals near us. Why would they be? They'd all be scared of us.
I was camping on land associated with the Anasazi, long dead Pueblo Indians that very few people know anything about. This was when I was a Boy Scout. We hiked for a few days and we saw black bears every day. It's normally a somewhat unusual sight and freaked out the adult leaders and caused us to religiously use anti-bear tactics like bear bags. Not totally related to the story, but it slowed us down, which led us to the events here. Anyway, we camped in a wood cabin at the bottom of a plateau, and the local rangers told us a bunch of spooky camp stories about the plateau and its relation to the long-dead Anasazi people. Even their real names is lost to history, as Anasazi is what the Navajo called them, meaning ancient enemies, or those who are not us. Another part of what they told us that stands out is that the Anasazi were obsessed with ravens, and possibly crows as well, and a lot of their superstition revolved around massive raven people, and people with raven heads, stuff like that. I completely forget all the other details at this point, as it was well over a decade ago. Anyway, my tent mate is a bit slow, and is also very allergic to peanuts. He ends up eating some of the pre-packaged food that contains a copious amount. That, combined with the ongoing poor planning, fear of bears, and sloppy leadership, causes the adults to decide to camp out on the plateau rather than keep going. On this scout ranch, you're only supposed to camp outside the designated areas and never on the particular plateau, just because of the geography and the environment. But forget the rules, because we do anyway. We set up camp, eat, lay the bear bag, and head off to sleep. That night, though, was the craziest thing. I could hear so much thunder, and so could my tent mate, but absolutely no rain, like insanely loud. My tent mate and I were terrified. It could have been heat lining, but it sounded impossibly close. We're terrified. He, the braver one of the two, actually goes out to check. As he opens the flap, I see the forest behind him. He comes back a few minutes later, and the thunder pretty much stops at the same time. He looks at me and goes to bed without saying anything at all. It's not unusual in itself. He could be pretty slow and non-social, and likely had mild autism in hindsight. But the next day, we wake up and a ton of things popped red flags. Firstly, our tent is facing an open field, which is very strange, because yesterday we both saw Forrest from when he left the tent to check. Second, no one else heard lightning that night, except for us, which was absolutely crazy as it was loud enough to wake everyone on Earth. Remember how my tent mate checked out the thunder as well? Well, he had no recollection of what he saw. He woke up confused, saying that the last thing that he remembered was just stepping outside. The good part though, the guy in the tent next door brought this up before we did. He also decided to get up and check it out, and he claims that when he stepped out of the tent There were no trees anywhere, just extremely long, tall pole objects, almost as if there were thousands of stilts. When he looked up, he also said that there was no lightning visible, but it was super bright, full moon on steroids bright. He also claimed that he had seen flying, winged, pitch black objects, bigger than cars, and they looked like they had wings on them and that they were round. He dove back inside and doesn't remember going to sleep or the noise going away. Remember the giant raven myths? I did, and I was scared shitless. I wouldn't have believed him if I hadn't have seen the trees and heard the thunder for myself.
When I was camping 30 years ago with my grandfather, we had both fallen asleep in the tent. I was notorious for having these night terrors about hearing sounds of monsters around us. So on this one particular night, as we were camping, I had just sat. I woke up and screamed to my grandfather saying that I can hear them, they're all around us. My grandfather woke up to comfort me, but then he went quiet. He quickly poked his head outside of our tent. He grabbed me by my arm. He said, "We're getting out of here now." As soon as I got my head out of that tent, I could smell the fire. Turns out there was a huge forest fire only meters away from where we were camping at. Had I have not woken up, we would have easily been killed.
I've always enjoyed the thought of ghosts and stuff, but never really believed firmly. I liked it just enough that it was entertaining, but not scary. So a friend of mine had this long-standing ghost story of the Bunny Man at her dad's house. A maybe 8-foot tall shadow figure with bunny ears or horns that she saw often in the woods by her dad's house as a child, and spoke enough about her dad and her sister teased her about it into adulthood. Her parents were separated, so she lived with her mom after the age of 10, and wasn't at her dad's house as often enough for this ghost story to really persist. A few incidents at sleepovers, but nothing big. When we were newly 20 years old, we moved back in with our parents to save some money and pay some bills. She and her mom didn't get along, so her dad gladly invited her to live with him in his house by the woods. She gladly accepted. Of course, her decision to move in brought up the Bunny Man, which we had a laugh about and moved on. I helped her move in because I owned a big car, and why not? Immediately sketchy things started to happen while we were moving in stuff. We would put things in places and 10 minutes later, they would be somewhere else. At some point, she put her purse inside while we were moving furniture, and we lost it. And we found it in my car. But whatever, explainable. But the more it happened, the more we began to kind of freak out. As we moved the last load of the night out of my car, it was dark. The outside lights, motion detected, flickered on and off while we were inside. We went back to my car, unsettled and ready to go back home and be done packing for the day. We get in and we turn on the lights. On my windshield, as plain as day, is a huge elongated handprint, as an angle as though someone was on top of my car when they pressed it. I can't stress to you how alone we were at the house. It's literally in the woods, far from anything. Her dad wasn't even home. He's a trucker and was gone for a few weeks while we moved in. We hadn't put the handprint there. Both of us froze, unable to speak. After a moment I reached up and touched it, and it came off. It was inside the windshield. I wiped it away and started to drive off, pretty spooked, but my friend started to straight up cry. She was a pretty stoic person. I think I have seen her cry maybe twice, and this was one of the times. She only lived there about 4 months in between houses, but it was a weird few months. If we start talking about the Bunny Man too long, something would happen. Lights would go off and turn on. Things would fall off shelves, and we would hear tapping on windows. If we were having a fire in the backyard, the fire would spark and pop. We never felt settled there. I'm amazed she slept there because the few nights I stayed in the guest bedroom, it was hard to sleep.
Just an overarching feeling of dread.
Very quiet part of the woods too, not a lot of bird sounds and not a lot of wildlife. Lots of weird shit happening in general, stuff going missing, stuff falling for no reason. And at some point, my boyfriend at the time window was broken with no possible suspects. Our other friend swore on her life that she saw a shadow man in the woods one night, and from then on out needed to be walked to her car from the house. Anyway, no real big specific incidents, but enough accumulating things that we knew what it was, and we knew it was haunted. My old broke down car is still currently there, because I had no place really to store it. So in 2 weeks I get to go visit while I get my car towed. Maybe I'll have another Bunny Man experience.
In May 2009, I just broke up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto and we're still living together because after the breakup we didn't really know many people in the city. Needless to say, the situation was relatively stressful and upsetting. So when a buddy of mine suggested a weekend camping trip full of fishing and hunting, I jumped to the chance. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful, loads of lush forests, farmers' fields and small rivers and creeks everywhere. We decided to camp along a fishing creek called Grindstone Creek. It was close to some wetlands and fishing is suggested to be great there. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field, I'm guessing. We were probably trespassing on our part too, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, shooting and drinking some quality beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs, and it was all in a really good night spirit. We really enjoyed the evening and decided to turn in around midnight. We shared a tent. My buddy fell asleep before me and I stayed up playing on my phone until around 1:30. I must have drifted off because the next thing I remembered was being woken up by a high-pitched yiping type sound. I was kind of groggy and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yiking sound was really off-putting. It almost sounded like it was a weird coyote. I laid there for a moment listening and then started playing on my phone again. The noise was annoying as hell. I tried to ignore it but it sounded like it was only getting closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet from the tent. At this point I was getting a little unsettled. I'd seen coyotes in Calgary before and I thought they were pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a smallish dog, but what if this had rabies or something? What if it could smell our food? I have pretty bad anxiety, so I'm prone to worrying about these type things. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake and he was. The noise also woken him. We discussed what we thought to do about the coyote, and we hadn't brought anything to scare off the critters, not even a BB gun, nothing. So we decided to shine the flashlight on it. Then if we hollered a lot, it would hopefully scare it off, right? So he unzipped the tent and I watched him pointing the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next though. His legs suddenly went all wobbly and he sort of stumbled back into the tent. He had this really terrified, dumbfounded look on his face when he looked at me and dabbled, "It's not a coyote, it's a dude. It's some weird dude." Normally I would have thought that he was messing with me. I'm a huge wimp and get scared easily. I don't even watch horror movies. But I've never seen somebody look that scared before. And I never want to see that expression on somebody's face again, so I knew that he wasn't pulling my leg. These weird yiping and howling sounds continued, and they only seemed to be getting louder. In retrospect, it really didn't sound like it was a coyote, but I guess in our groggy states it was a pretty rational way of thinking of all of this. Anyways, he kept telling me to just look out of the tent flap to make sure it's not doing anything crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown panic attack. My heart was racing. I felt terrible, but I had to look. I slowly peeked out of the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. That's when I saw him. He was standing only a few arms lengths away from the tent. He was swaying a little, wearing a baseball cap. What made it awful? He was just really creepy. He was wearing some woman's gear. That's when I knew that something was really off about this guy. If the making high-pitched noise at strangers wasn't scary enough to give that away anyway. After I pulled my head back inside the tent, my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at this guy to go away. My buddy then started yelling, "Excuse me, can you go away? We're trying to sleep here." And the noise stopped. It was dead silent, and that's when we heard the footsteps running towards the tent. They stopped right outside our tent though, and didn't waste any time. We then started yelling, "Seriously, go away, we've got phones, and if you don't go, we're gonna call the cops." With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off. It sounded like he was moving towards the road. Needless to say, we lay there awake, absolutely petrified until the first signs of sunlight. We then got the hell out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home, and we're both pretty embarrassed about how scared we got, but it definitely wasn't mainly on either of our parts. I think we are both ashamed of how we let some weirdo freak us out so much, but here's the thing, what if this had turned out differently? Sometimes I wonder what would have happened had we been a couple of girls. I'm not saying he was a serial killer, but who the hell goes around to people's tents like that making weird sounds? I guess I'll never know, and for that, I'm kind of glad. Camping Horror by Majoli. This happened to my parents back in the late 80s. They're in their mid-20s when all of this occurred. My parents decided to go camping in cool California. When they got there, it was kind of late. My mum was sitting down on a log while my dad was unpacking the truck. While sitting down, she heard walking around their campsite, so she went and quietly told my dad that she heard somebody walking around. They then got the hell out of there, just in case, and they decided to drive another 3 miles down the road with their headlights off, so that way it would be unlikely they could be followed. Once they got there, they set up camp and began drinking really heavily to a boxing match on the radio. Eventually, they settled in for the night. Now, they don't know for sure whether the next event is connected to the first, but they believe it is. So they settled in and my dad was asleep far before my mum. My mum was in the halfway there state where you're half awake and asleep. Suddenly, she heard footsteps outside the tent. She abruptly snapped back to consciousness and listened. She tried waking up my dad, but he was way too out of it. She listened then for what seemed like hours when she suddenly hears, in the creepiest voice you could probably ever imagine, saying, "Hey, I'm gonna kill you." While saying this, the man ran. She believes what to be a knife along the tent. She could hear him walking and dragging the knife. She was literally frozen. She couldn't say anything or even move. With her mouth agape, she finally snapped out of it and screamed, "Jim, grab your shotgun, kill him quick." With that, my dad woke up abruptly. They heard the snapping of twigs and footsteps, and they heard the guy running away. Now of course they didn't have a shotgun, they were only bluffing to try and scare this guy off. The fact that it worked though is amazing. My dad got up seconds later and began to run after him, but he was long gone. After that, my parents decided they were getting the hell out of there before anything else happened. They then went back up to my dad's truck only to find that the tyres were slashed. They're in the middle of nowhere with no way out and some maniac was trying to kill them. They actually tried blowing up their tyres with one of those things you use to blow up rafts. Obviously it didn't work. They had to try though, right? So about an hour or so later of being terrified, a ranger that was patrolling the area come along to help them out. He brought them back to town so they could fix their tyres. While talking to the ranger, they found out that they had been searching for any weird activity due to a recent murder nearby. My parents were very likely to be the next murderer's victims. This happened to myself and a close friend just last month. We decided to go on a 2-night backpacking / camping trip in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. We're both very comfortable with nature and spent a lot of time camping, hunting, fishing, etc. We hiked about 5 miles into a small lake and set up camp on a small beach. This was not a heavily trafficked area, and we didn't expect to run into anyone. So on our first night, we were just sitting around a campfire. We suddenly saw a flashlight moving on the other side of the lake at around 10:30. This was fairly unusual, however, we didn't think much of it. But as time went on, the flashlight kept moving around the lake and it kept on getting closer and closer to our campsite. We kept discussing who could possibly be wandering around the woods in the middle of the night, and we didn't particularly want to see any unwelcome guests. One thing was clear though, the person or people were heading for our campsite. We then moved and wandered off into the woods to try and figure out just who or what was coming up towards us. I took a small axe with me and had a .22 rifle. Now we weren't expecting trouble, and we certainly didn't want to make any, but we figured that we might as well cover our base. Now, moment of truth, the flashlights come near the light of our fire, and it's one man. He has a beard and is probably in his 40s. The scary part was that he was carrying what appeared to be a pump-action shotgun. He walked around the campsite a few times, then proceeded to enter our tent. After rummaging around for a minute or so, he come out yelling, "I know you're out here, why don't you come and say hello?" My friend and I remained motionless under a hemlock tree about 50 yards away. That's when the man proceeded to fire his shotgun into the woods, not too far from where we were, and he swung around his flashlight several times. And after what felt like hours, he grabbed my friend's backpack and a few articles of clothing we had drying off near the campfire and threw them in to burn. Now my friend, who trained the .22 at the man, asked me if I should shoot. I told him absolutely not unless he points a shotgun towards our direction and spots us. Thankfully, that man moved away from where the camp was after a little while. We waited until his flashlight was on the other side of the lake again. We then ran out, grabbed everything we could fit into my backpack and took off. We ran on the trail with the flashlights and made it back to my car as the sun was coming up. We immediately told the police department about what had happened and reported it, where we then spoke with some forest rangers, and that was it. I have never heard anything back from the police. It wasn't a mysterious case, but it creeped the hell out of both of us.
Hello. I have an encounter you may or may not be interested in. My background. I'm 43 years old, a combat veteran from Operation Iraqi Freedom 2003 to 2005. I have 10 years service in the Army. I've been an avid hunter from age of 7 years old. My encounter took place in Fayette County, West Virginia, not too far from my house in an area called Cotton Hill, located where the New and Gully Rivers meet. It was November 1996, rifle season for antlered deer. Myself, my wife, and uncle were at a camp and we were sitting on the campfire when on the ridge above us was a loud, guttural growl, unlike anything I've ever heard in those woods. It lasted about 4 to 5 seconds. I might add that during the day, while hunting, it was like all the deer that had been there all disappeared. It seemed like there was no sign of them. We never saw what made that noise, but it made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. And I haven't let me stop enjoying the outdoors though, but let's just say, I'm more aware and prepared when I go out into the woods.
The following account occurred roughly 3 years ago during the summer of 2012. It's always been difficult for me to talk about this, but I found that writing it out and sharing it was somewhat therapeutical. I was 17 at the time and I'd gotten my first job. I lived in rural Western Virginia in a small mountain community. My mum's friend owned a camping resort not far from a house that had a general store, and she said she'd pay for me to help out in the store during the busy months in the summer. It was a pretty easy job, and I met a lot of out-of-towners, which was nice because our community could get so isolated. Most of us just lived really far apart from each other. So one day, a big burly mountain man came into the store. He was in his late 40s or early 50s. He was 6'5" and about 280 pounds. He looked dirty, looked like he worked outside a lot. His clothes were sort of in tatters and he had a long beard. We had a few of these woodsy hermits type in the area, and this definitely looked like one of them. He bought some basic items, one of which was one of our homemade bars of soap. When he came to the register, he looked me up and down carefully. Didn't even talk for a minute, just stared. His people skills clearly needed work. "Did you make this soap?" he asked me. "Possibly. I've helped out with that sometimes." "You make a lot of your own stuff?" "Yeah, toiletries and stuff like that, yeah." "I like that," he said, nodding to himself. I honestly did not know how to respond. I quickly rang up his items and he paid with some crumpled up money. Before he left, he said, "You cook too?" Sometimes," I replied. "Bet the boys around here are itching to marry you," he said as he smiled to himself. I said nothing. I was puzzled as to what I'd said that stood out to make me wife material. I told Christine, who was my mum's friend and the boss, about the bizarre encounter and she laughed it off. So did my family and friends. But then, Mountain Man started turning up more often. We had chatted a little bit here and there, and I found out that he had a cabin in the woods. He claimed he built it with his bare hands. He said he hunted and lived off of the land. Now over time our chat escalated. He started telling me about how that I looked so nice and how it would be so nice to have a woman to be around that could make those things and cook. One time, he even said I had the birthing hips that men lust for. He even started inviting me to fish with him, hunt with him, see his place, etc. And I always politely declined. But he got more and more insistent, and I told Christine about how uncomfortable he was starting to make me. The intensity to which he said these things really scared me. Christine then said that when he come in, she would go and ring him up. Thanks to her, I started talking to him less and less. I thought it wouldn't have been a bad idea to not talk to him at all anymore, but one night I was closing off and it was late, around 10 PM. Christina had left about half an hour ago, and I was leaving by myself. The only two cars in front of the store were an old blue pickup and mine. I was immediately alarmed because I knew Mountain Man drove a blue pickup, but I didn't see him a lot. I just saw his car, so I walked out quickly to my car and checked the back seat before I started it up. But just then, when I first turned the key into the ignition, I got nothing but splutters. I tried several times and got scared quickly. Of all nights, why was this happening tonight? I remembered asking myself angrily. Just as I was reaching for my phone to call for help, there was a loud pounding on the driver's side window. I'm shocked that I didn't wee myself. I didn't even want to look because it was him, I knew it, but I did. My suspicions were confirmed. He had this huge stupid smile across his face and I could see exactly which one of his teeth were missing. "Need some help?" he said loudly through the window. I shook my head furiously. "My dad is on his way," I said, hoping to scare him off. I hadn't spoken to my dad in years. Mountain Man laughed. "No, he's not. Open the door." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. How did he know I was bluffing? "No, leave me alone," I said firmly and tried to sound angry. He then pulled the handle, but I had the doors locked when I first got in. He kept furiously pulling the handle and started pounding on the window. "Leave now or I'm calling the cops," I screamed at him. He clearly wasn't getting the message, so I pulled out my phone and called 911. I must have sounded hysterical to the dispatcher, as I knew that she could hear him pounding too. She said that she would have officers out there ASAP, but they could be a while. "The cops are on their way now, leave me alone," I screamed at Mountain Man, who didn't seem to let that deter him, but after a few more minutes of pounding, he suddenly stopped and walked towards his truck. I watched him go. Hopefully he would leave me alone, but no. This time he come back with a crowbar in his hand. "No," I screamed at him, "Get away from me." He started swinging at the driver's side window with the crowbar. I ducked down into the passenger seat on the floor and covered the back of my neck, almost like you get taught to in tornado drills. I heard the sickening crack of the window, but not for long. Suddenly I heard male voices shouting, telling Mountain Man to get away from the car. I stand up and see two men approaching, one with a shotgun pointed at Mountain Man. I recognise them as a couple of guests staying at the resort for a camping trip. I breathed a sigh of relief and got out of the car, telling them that the police were on their way. I then thanked them profusely and waited for the police. Surprisingly, Mountain Man didn't make any moves to get away, but the cops come pretty quickly after that, so he didn't have much of a chance. They then took him away and I gave them my statement. I was pretty shaken up for a while afterwards. A few weeks later I finally got the scope on the man. Apparently he had a history of mental illness. He'd been in and out of the state institutions. He really had been living in an old cabin in the woods, where he wasn't taking his meds and had an issue that was only getting worse. When I was around 12 years old, I spent the afternoon at a friend's house who I knew from high school. He lived in a neighbourhood that I wasn't all that familiar with, so when we decided to take our bikes out for a ride, I simply followed him until we come to a large wooded area. It was in a valley that descended away from the roadside and, from what I could see, become rather dense and overgrown quite quickly. Because of all the foliage, we decided to leave our bikes and go on foot. We had been hiking for about 20 minutes when we realised that we could no longer see the spot where we had left our bikes, and we were literally surrounded on every side by thick vegetation. Being boys, we thought this was absolutely fantastic and decided to carry on further into the valley. At some point, we come across what looked like to be a large abandoned campsite. There were some old cans laying around that looked like they had been there and used to boil water, an old ashtray fire pit, and quite a lot of plastic sheeting. We had a look around but didn't really find anything interesting, so decided to carry on with our hike. Just as we're leaving, somebody called out to us from somewhere on the other side of the camp. A homeless man then appeared. No doubt the camp dweller then demanded to know what we were doing with his things. We explained that we weren't taking anything, we're just looking around, and he immediately calmed down. We made polite conversation for a few minutes, exchanged names, and gave a vague idea of where he'd come from. At this point, we didn't really feel like we were in any danger with the homeless guy, who was actually quite friendly. We then decided to say our goodbyes, but he told us that we had to give him something before we went. Now, we hadn't brought any food or water with us, so didn't even have anything to offer him, and apparently he took exception to this. He started yelling at us and demanded our shoes, which neither of us were willing to part with. We then started to try and slowly back away from him when he suddenly pulled out a knife and started running towards us. I don't remember exactly which way he went for us or how far we had to run, as I was so terrified and full of adrenaline. I did look back a few times and realised that we were in fact getting away from him, but he was still chasing us even though there was no cover from the trees at this point. We reached the side of the road where we'd left our bikes and fortunately had enough of a lead on him so that way we could hop on and pedal away from him. A couple of builders who were unloading materials up the road saw that we were panicked and stopped us to find out what was going on. We gave them a brief version of the events and they went back to see if he was still lurking around, but apparently he was long gone. My friend told his folks what happened that day, but we never heard any more about it. As far as I know, he could still be living at the campsite, but I certainly wasn't going to find out for myself. My dad was a journalist for most of his life. He's now an author. This is one of his stories from hiking the Appalachian Trail. My dad hiked the trail mostly by himself, but occasionally would run into other hikers and spend a few days hiking and camping with them. He said it was always a pleasant experience and he made a lot of really good friends out of it. On one of these such trails, he met Jeff and Molly, a really nice couple, and he began hiking with them for a couple of days. After camping with them and becoming fairly good friends, they went their separate ways and my dad pulled ahead of them. He was about 2 days further down the trail than them, and when he stopped at a town to get some food and relax, that's when he found out that Jeff and Molly had been murdered in their sleep by a stranger on the trail. They had both been either stabbed or shot. It's absolutely terrifying to think that my dad had literally camped with them days prior.
My boyfriend and I are a young couple in their mid-college years. We decided that we wanted to get away from work and our studies for the weekend, so we took a trip to the nearest hiking trail that is a part of the Appalachian Trail. We decided to leave on a Friday once I got off work and back up the trail in order to camp. I work in a restaurant and it's very difficult to set a time on when I'm going to leave work. I ended up leaving work around 4, but we said that no matter what, we would be going on this trip, and we finally left for the trail. We began hiking around 5:30. My boyfriend was an Eagle Scout, so we had all the necessary supplies for a successful camping trip. A tent, sleeping pads, pots, pans, stove, clothes, food, and of course, necessary substances to free our minds after the long hike. The first part of the hike was absolutely exhausting. It was all uphill, and we were both carrying at least 40 pounds in our metal-framed backpacks. An hour later, we finally passed the first shelter. If not many of you know, a shelter on this trail is about 10 foot by 15 foot, approximately, log cabin that only has 3 walls, and is open to the outside. It's specifically used as a shelter to sleep in or hide from the rain. Midway through the hike, it began to pour dramatically in the forest. Sooner or later, we were both soaked from head to toe. Thick fog grew quickly, as it had been hot and humid Friday. The trail became very slippery, and our pace slowed down tremendously. We had hoped that we were getting closer to the camping site, but it turned very dark very quickly. We took a rest in the dark as it poured on us, in hopes that we would find our headlamps. Once we found our headlamps, we placed them on our heads, still struggling to balance ourselves on top of the rocky and muddy path. I thought by that point we would never make it to our shelter. We walked, never giving up, although I wanted to. As my socks and shoes were wet, I was tired, hungry, drenched, and cold. The temperature has dropped more than 25 degrees as we made our way up. It was 8:30 when we finally made it through to the second shelter in campgrounds. There was a split in the path. Either you could walk straight to continue to the top of the view, which was about 1.5 miles away, or you could turn slightly to the right and walk to the campgrounds. Or you could take a 90-degree turn to the right, walk down to the shelter. At that point, we were drenched from head to toe and needed to dry off. It was still raining to beat the band, so it would have been nearly impossible to set up our tent and camp. We had decided to stay put at the shelter until the rain calmed down. We didn't hear anyone out the shelter, so I was extremely excited to have the place to ourselves and take a few tokes, if you know what I mean. After our hike, I was dead set on it. Once we walked down to the shelter and got to the opening, there was a man and a woman in their 60s. We instantly thought to ourselves that they were an older married couple who wanted to get away for the weekend too. We told them that we wouldn't be bothering them for long, so we wet our backpacks down and attempted to dry off. The couple was very welcoming with a lantern and an absorbing towel for me to dry off in. My boyfriend and I took off our shirts since they were both carrying a lot of weight in water. The couple seemed to be very normal. The man brought a cute dog with him that I enjoy playing with. We began introducing ourselves with our names, where we were from, and what we were doing there. They both said they were in their 60s. Their names were Joe and Maya, and they were just messing around for the weekend. In between sentences, they were taking large gulps of what looked like to be alcohol in their water pack. They said they were just having fun and met online, which veered off into dropping hints that they were on the trail having an affair. The older woman, who says that she comes from West Virginia, struck me to be very off. It began with her looks, having scraggly, shoulder-length gray hair, with circular glasses resting on her face. Her teeth were very dark, nearly covered with a brown film, as if she used hard drugs in the past. She wore a pullover, hiking boots, and jean shorts that nearly exposed everything. Joe, on the other hand, was just an average white male who had gray hair and was a tad overweight. They spoke about their past employments and what they had done in life. Maya said she was a writer, which I admired. Information about ourselves was exchanged too, since they seemed very friendly. I was in a very bad mood though, and very irritable until I smoked some. My boyfriend and I periodically showed each other our phones in order to communicate, as we didn't have a bit of service in the shelter we were at. We agreed that it was okay if we started smoking, since they were becoming drunk. They said they didn't mind, but would like to join. I thought it was absolutely insane that they wanted to smoke at that age. The man only took 2 hits, but the woman took many. She was struggling a lot to even flick the lighter. The guys began their own conversation, and the woman and I veered off on ours as well. The woman began with asking me to tell her a story. As she inched closer and closer to me, she asked me to tell her a story. She grew more and more demanding, saying,
Tell me a story.
My boyfriend and I met online, just as they said they did. So I was going to tell her about the story of how we met. I began the story with, So you met him online, right? The woman nearly cuts me off and angrily says, What? Why would you say that? I said to her, You all met online, right? She nearly cuts me off again and more aggressively says, Why would you say that? I said again, Earlier Joe said you met online, didn't you? She nearly shouts and growls.
Why would you say that?
I wanted to jump away from the conversation. So I asked her, Well, you're a writer, you said, right? So why don't you tell me one of your best stories? The woman becomes happy and giggly again, and while swirling her hands around in her head of hair, she said, Well, I'm a writer in my mind. I was extremely confused and creeped out. I didn't know what to say. I'm the type of person to laugh it off, so that's what I did. She just said she enjoyed being a writer in her mind. I looked over at my boyfriend and Joe's conversation, and it seemed to be as normal as can be. There was absolutely nothing wrong about it, but Maya nearly gave me the chills as she got my attention, getting closer into my face, asking me what I was saying. The problem was that I wasn't saying anything. I was absolutely silent, ignoring her. She began talking to herself. She would make very in-depth hand gestures as she spoke to herself, then would ask me what I was saying to her. I wasn't saying a word, and she would wonder what I was telling her. She would abruptly say, Yes, no, maybe, no way, yeah, it can't, wait, huh? As she would rock back and forth, waving her arms around. She began crossing her legs, holding her arms up in the air, above her head. She started to shout,
Coming out, I'm calling out to all of you, come.
She was nearly talking gibberish. The older man's attention was caught and asked her what in the world she was doing. She said, I'm calling out, it's witchcraft. I was nearly high and terrified of all my surroundings. It stormed pretty badly in the background and it was black all around us. A small lamplight rested on a beam above our heads in the middle of the wooden shelter. I was wet and very vulnerable. Everything slowly began to get worse that night. Maya kept slurring her words, and the man demanded she get into her sleeping bag and sleep. I sat against the wall next to my boyfriend very closely, as the man crawled into his sleeping bag, and Maya attempted to put her legs in the sleeping bag, but couldn't. She moved around for a very long time, and finally curled up next to Joe, on top of her sleeping bag. She was probably freezing, as it was 35 degrees by 9:30. Only a few minutes passed, and we heard Maya whisper. Maya said angrily, What did you give me? She growls again, What did you give me? The man finally woke up and demanded, What? Maya hits him on his back, and yells, What did you give me? She jumped up immediately facing us. Her eyes were nearly all black, as her pupils were so enlarged. She looked nearly sadistic, and yelled at us, What did he give me? My boyfriend and I both tensed up, nearly losing our shit. She screams again, What did he give me? Even louder, as her voice screeched into my eardrums. She once again turned around to the man, laying down behind him. She slowly whispered into his ear, softly growling, Did you give me acid? It began to run through my mind that he drugged her, or she was having a flashback of a bad trip. Joe attempted to calm her down, but she was still restless. She laid down for approximately 5 minutes, but Maya immediately sat up. She faced us with her legs crossed, and she stared at us, without breaking contact for at least 5 minutes. She did this every so often, sitting up, staring at us, and laying back down. She would do this over and over again, so we decided to leave immediately. We finally made our way out as she stared at us for one last time. We pitched camp as far away as possible, but I remained sleepless that night in fear Maya would find our tent and crawl into it.
"20 years ago, when my dad was younger, he used to live on a big farmhouse that was supposedly haunted. The house was hundreds of years old. On one Christmas Eve, his mum and my dad, who lived alone, could see that there was a weird light coming from the shed all the way down the end of the garden. Now, nobody should have been in there. My grandma always told my dad to never ever go down there. Well, that was up until this point. So my dad put on his coat and, very paranoid, stepped out to go and investigate what was going on. The closer he got, the stronger the smell of cigarette smoke became apparent. He was sure that there was some teenager in there messing with him. He went round to the back way and peered through the window. As he did so, the light instantly went out. This was simultaneous with the smell of smoke. This was more than enough to scare him into literally sprinting back to the farmhouse. As he got back there, my grandma slammed the door open, quickly ushered him inside and slammed it shut again. She said, "Don't worry, I've already called the fire department, they're on their way now." Confused as anything, my dad then asked my grandma what she was talking about. She said, "Look, the fire, you were right next to it." To my dad's horror, as he turned, he could see that the shed was in a full blaze. It couldn't have been possible because my dad was only there seconds prior, and whatever that light was long gone, and the smell of the smoke, he didn't even get time to tell my grandma about it. To this day, he says he knows there's only one explanation to as what started that fire.